Thank you so much for having me. I'm here to present, as Anna mentioned, a piece of research I did under the direction of Jeff Sachs, along with Anna Lopresti and Caroline Fox, on how the Sustainable Development Goals are proceeding in U.S. cities. Okay, is that better? Okay. And so from that research, we're going to talk about what are the challenges to realizing the SDGs in the U.S. cities. So I'll talk about what we know about the SDGs in the U.S. cities and how we're doing, and then I'll talk a little bit about what are the challenges, therefore, in achieving them, and then, as Anna has asked us all, to present some ideas on ways we might take action. A little bit of background: I work at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It operates since 2012 under the auspices of the Secretary General. Ban Ki-moon asked us to organize researchers, academics, think tanks, and other knowledge-producing institutions to work on solutions for the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. To do that, we do three different things. One is policy analysis around SDG data, pathways, mapping, and other research. And we also have a network of networks, really, and we have over nearly 40 networks, either nationally or regionally based, or some of them are also theoretically based or topically based. So we have a network on oceans, a network on agriculture, and I'll be presenting work that comes out of the U.S. network. The U.S. network contains over 120 institutions in 44 states, including the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Thirdly, we have SDG Academy, which produces massive online open courses and other knowledge-producing courses around the SDGs and what it will take to achieve them. Here are some of the research projects that we have. There's a global index that is done, and that includes 163 of the 193 member countries. We also do a state-level index and a cities-level index. With these, I'll go back. Each of these share a common methodology, and because of that, that allows us to use each of them to either set context or provide a bit of nuance, depending on what level we're talking about. This is the common methodology. It was audited by the Joint Research Commission of the European Union. And because of this common methodology, there are some indicators that overlap across all three levels. And so this allows us to say, let's compare how Milwaukee is doing to say how Florida is doing to say how maybe Uganda is doing. There are more indices that are being developed as well. So now there's a European Cities Index, there's an African Region Index, there's many more that are coming out. And because of this common methodology, we were now able to compare across multiple levels in multiple regions. And this will become more important later in the presentation, where I'm able to share some of the insights because of this methodology. So for our report, we use 57 indicators across 15 goals. We do not include life below water or partnerships for the goals. This is mostly due to data reasons, but we would be very interested if you have ideas on how we might be able to include this. For each of those 57 indicators, we normalize the indicator to a 0 to 100 scale, and then we color code the performance from a red, orange, yellow, and green to give a sense of how well you're doing on those specific indicators, and then we average those at the goal level, and then again to get an overall score. So from our global index, we're able to say that the US ranks 35th in the world on the SDGs. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and France are at the top. And the US has a 75% on the index. And we kind of use that score as a way to say you're about 75% of the way towards achieving the SDGs. However, when we localize the results, we see that there's quite a bit of work to do in the US. More specifically, this is the results of our state index. If there were green on this map, it would indicate that that state was making good progress towards achieving the SDGs by 2030. There isn't. No state so far is green, and there's quite a bit of red. There's a lot of geographic clustering. You can see that the red is located mostly in the south, and the better performers are on the coasts. This breaks down the results a little bit more at the state level, and you can see, I know you can't read the text, but the figure on the right shows the 15 different goals that we've included, and Massachusetts and Washington State are at the top, and Mississippi and Louisiana are at the bottom. This, if we disaggregate a bit more, this is our cities index results. And again, you won't see any green dots, unfortunately, but we hope in coming years that will change. The size of the dot represents the size of the MSA. MSA is a Census Bureau designation that encompasses a little bit more than the city limits. So it's the city plus any suburban areas that have heavy commuting into the city. And we did most of our data at the MSA level. Here, one thing to note is that even states that are performing relatively well, like California, have cities that are performing in the top 10 and in the bottom 10. So once we disaggregate those state results, we see actually quite a bit of variation. And here are the overall results for the cities dashboard. The top performing cities are San Francisco and San Jose, and the bottom performing cities are Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Jackson, Mississippi. And this should just give you a general sense of what goals we're doing the best on and what goals there's a lot more work to do. A few things to note. 0 cities scored 100 at the goal or overall level. On the other end, 101 cities scored a 0 on at least one indicator. So this just indicates to us how widespread the need for progress is on the SDGs at the city level. Okay, so what types of cities do best? We analyzed lots of different variables here, from post-industrial cities to demographic data around cities. And really, the best predictor of city performance is life expectancy. Here you can see a graph of life expectancy and progress towards the SDGs. A notable outlier is McAllen, Texas, and there's a profile that was written, I think, in The Atlantic around that city prior to this work, but still could be interesting. I think what we take away from the fact that life expectancy is such a good predictor of this score is that the SDGs truly are systematic. So life expectancy includes both individual and social and societal determinants of health. So all of those things are coming together to impact how cities are performing. And what life expectancy cannot say is talk about the quality of that life. And so I hope to talk about a little bit more about that through our results. So I'm going to break down our results into 4 different sections as a way to talk about insights that we have, and hopefully that will point us to what it will take to achieve the SDGs. And the first way is the worst performing indicators. I might go a little quickly through this because our presenters throughout today and yesterday have already talked quite a bit about the importance of sustainable transit and rent burden. If you look at sustainable transit, there are really only 2 cities that are performing in the green on sustainable transit, and that's the percent of commuters that are using sustainable transit. And even in our best city, less than 50% of commuters are using sustainable transit. So that should be an indication that we have a long way to go. And as has been noted by other presenters, there's not a lot of sustainable transit at all in US cities. The number drops pretty rapidly, and the majority of cities have less than 15% of their commuters using sustainable transit. This works in conjunction with rent burden. So rent burden, again, is percent paying more than 30% of their income on rent. In the best place, the best city, 40% of residents are rent burdened. And in the worst place, Miami, more than 60% of their residents are rent burdened. These 2 things are also work together, though. So as renters get pushed out of the city, they have fewer and fewer options available for sustainable transit. So that means that you double down on inequality and marginalization of these people who are getting pushed out. And I think it proposes a big problem to city planners and all of us as we think about how education is tied to location, how city services are often tied to the center of cities and not in suburban areas, and how we're going to keep people connected to economies if they're not able to live and not able to get there. So I think this kind of points to the systemic aspect of the SDGs. And it points us to our first idea for action, which is whether or not a city has officially adopted the SDGs as a lens. You can incorporate the SDGs as a checklist, as a lens for thinking through, does this project, how does this project impact water? How will this project impact inequality? How will it impact education? And if we are able to use this lens, we'll move a long way towards more systematic thinking on whatever project we're doing. And I think what we see in this report is the need for that style of thinking. As an aside, I think we're starting to see about plastic bag bans in California. There's research coming out that plastic bag bans have led to more people buying plastic bags than ever had before because they now don't have them. And I think this whack-a-mole approach, it's not that it's not a great idea to stop using plastic bags, it's that this whack-a-mole approach actually can have negative side effects in other ways. And the SDGs are kind of a way to contain the disaster of maybe trying to address one issue while making another worse. Another way to break down the results is through international comparison. One way is the gender wage gap. And any analysis of gender is incomplete if it's binary or doesn't include race, but this is the limitations of the ACS data that we've used. Here you can see that US cities underperform both US states and EU cities, often by half. The worst EU cities are doing about as well as the best US cities. So we might think that US is doing pretty badly if we saw a gender wage gap on its own, but by being able to compare it to similar economies or similar places, we're actually starting to get a bit more context about where work needs to be done. Another place where we see this is incarceration rate. Here is a map of the worst performing cities and the worst performing countries on incarceration rate, and you can see that Lakeland, Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, and Augusta, Georgia have incarceration rates almost triple of the worst performing countries, which are El Salvador, Turkmenistan, Cuba, and of course, the United States. And this brings us to also city level representation. So as we're seeing these impacts such on gender, race, we actually have to ask ourselves who's leading these conversations, whose voices are being included. The organization Who Leads estimates that there are less than 10 Native Americans in city leadership in the US. This is particularly shocking because we know that 70% of Native Americans live in cities. 90% of elected officials are white and 0.03% are Native American. This extends to people of color and women as well. The UN has claimed that and has told us that to achieve the goals for climate change, we must follow the leadership of Indigenous people, and we're seeing that through this data that we're a real far away from actually doing that. Just to also highlight that this extends beyond racial identity and also extends to class. Very few of our represented officials are actually workers. So workers are about half of US citizens and less than a tenth of elected officials. And that leads us to the second idea for action, which is engage communities and support the leadership of those most impacted. And of course, this makes a difference at the governmental level, but it also makes a difference in our communities, in our workplaces, in our cultural activities. And this is something that we can all do wherever we are without having to wait for the next election cycle. How many of the ideas are actually out there in the world and we're not listening to them? When Anna had asked us to think about ideas for action, I was thinking about Ida B. Wells, a Black woman who's one of the founders of the data science movement. She was working during the time of Reformation, and many of her Black male colleagues were being hung and lynched, and she decided to do a data mapping to figure out where those lynchings were happening. Ida B. Wells had some great ideas for how to end these things. She was never asked. And so I wonder how many Ida B. Wellses are out there now whose ideas we could be supporting. The third way we might think about this is through the Leave No One Behind agenda. So the Leave No One Behind agenda is the first agenda adopted by the SDGs. It says that those who are the most marginalized need to have their needs addressed first in any SDGF programming. To look at that, we created a sub-index looking at various Leave No One Behind indicators. I'll highlight a few of them here. One of them is segregation. So this is a map of the city of Chicago, and each dot represents the race of the household. Blue dots represent white households, orange dots represent Hispanic households, green dots represent Black households, and red dots represent Asian households. And we can see the stark effects of segregation in Chicago. But I should highlight that this is not just a story about Chicago. You can go to any metropolitan city in the US and you would see this. And I also just want to highlight that it's worse in the north and in the northeast. So I think we're often sometimes in the US primed to think that in the south things are worse, but I think this is one example of how we're also culpable in this issue. Another way to look at the Leave No One Behind agenda is the disparity in unemployment rate. So these are the worst performing cities in the US, and this is comparing Native American unemployment rate to white non-Hispanic employment rate. And it averages about 3 times higher for Native Americans. I also just want to highlight what those cities are. Many of them are in the Rust Belt, which I think is particularly interesting. This has been talked about a little bit earlier today, so I won't spend too much time on this, but this is low-income energy burden. So the amount low-income people are spending on energy. The expertly determined rate should be around 2%, so that's that green line. In the best performing city, which is urban Honolulu, they are at 10 times higher than that, at 20%. In the worst performing city, which is Spokane, Washington, they're 40 times that at 80%. So this brings me to the third idea for action, which is proactively address injustice and move towards repair. If we look back at this segregation map, this is not something that can be quickly changed with a policy action. This is centuries of continued colonization and the legacies of slavery that we have yet to address. And without addressing those, we probably will not be able to address effectively address any other of the SDGs either, because a map like this doesn't just talk about where people live, but who has access to resources, what schools people go to, how close they live to public transportation, quality of life in those neighborhoods, and moving people in a broad scale across cities is not something that's easy to do. And so we won't be able to likely address any of the SDGs until we proactively address these past injustices. Finally, data gaps, so what we're not actually able to measure, I think says a lot about what needs to be done to achieve the SDGs in the US. There are lots of data gaps, so if there are any researchers in the room, I'd love to talk to you afterwards because we need some help. But I just want to highlight a few things that are particularly of note. One, we don't have a literacy rate in the US. We're not able to say how many people are literate. A second thing that is particularly striking is about water data. It's very difficult to know if your city or county has good water. More importantly, it's harder to know if there's lead poisoning in that water. And this is something that came to the front of our national consciousness through Flint, Michigan, but now has expanded to thousands of cities and communities across the US. Part of the problem is the way that we're mandated to look at lead drinking water, and part of it is around transparency around that data. Just to note that Flint, Michigan still does not have clean drinking water nearly 6 years after that scandal. And so the fourth idea for action is create accountability measures, whether that is pressuring our local government or developing new indicators, or filing Freedom of Information Act requests, which is how we found out about those thousands of cities across the US with the lead drinking water. Creating accountability measures can help us move towards the action that will be necessary to achieve the SDGs. And there are some ways that this is already happening. Alex yesterday spoke about voluntary local reviews. The city of New York was one of the first to do so. Lots of other cities are hopping on board and other communities as well. Carnegie Mellon University, which is a university in our network, has said that they will be the first university to do a voluntary university review. There are also lots of local people who are impacted by these issues who are working together already. The US has not had an official maternal mortality rate statistic in nearly 20 years. We are one of the, I think we might be the only, if not one of the few countries of the 193 member countries that does not have an official maternal mortality statistic. So, and we know that maternal mortality more deeply impacts Black women than other women, and we know that maternal mortality rates in the US are going up. There are lots of community-based organizations that are coming together to figure out what to do about that, and those organizations include mothers, grandmothers, partners, people who give birth, as well as obstetricians, public health officials, and others who are working to address this. And so there are, whatever the issue that you might be working on, I encourage you to think about who is already working on that within the community. Okay, so in conclusion, I just want to say that hopefully what this report has shown is what we will do, what the status quo is. So what will happen if we choose not to take action? And I hope potentially that through some of these ideas, you will be inspired to link up with other people in your community or in your own life to find ways to change that status quo.
Alana, thank you so much for this presentation. The reason this really was very much needed because one of the things that we really haven't done enough with is connected up the reality that to achieve the SDGs, you have to deal with social equity issues, and we don't deal with them. And to some extent, a lot of the work that people do, it becomes very important, but context also matters. And what your presentation raises for us is the context issue. And there are 2 points I would make in brief summary, because I know we're short of time. The first point is, the way I finally come to frame it, I say, if you really believe in capitalism, you need to be a social democrat. By that I mean, unless we have in place systems that ensure that that a little bit comes off the top and keeps going to the bottom, all the disparities in the data you have, and they're I can tell you they're very multi-collineated. One would have trouble with an econometric model with this data. Going back to my past life as an economist. So the first issue is, while all these volunteer efforts have to work, it's a political issue too, and I think that's what this presentation raises. The second point I want to make about the data, and when you look at how GHG spread and so on, I'm reminded there's another conference going on here today and tomorrow. There's a history conference on the changing landscape of American cities that Ken Jackson is heading up, and it's over at Faculty House if you want to crash it, but not now. And Ken Jackson wrote a book called The Crabgrass Frontier in 1982, and what Ken said at the very last page of his book, page 302, but who counts? What he said was, the United States is going to be the world's first and last suburban nation. And he said the reason this is going to happen is nobody else is going to be able to afford to do exactly what we did. So part of the problem when you look at this data and you look at the sprawl and you look at some of these issues is what we've done is, especially in the 20th century, we took our older cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and we tried to retrofit them to the automobile. And it didn't work very far because people began to fight the idea of having highways going through their neighborhood. So it was limited. But to the extent that it worked, we manufactured land by making suburbanization work, but at an environmental cost. What's happening now is all the newer cities, the cities that grew up around the automobile, are trying to retrofit back to transit, to radial transit-oriented cities, and we're doing the same thing in some of these cities too. So there's 2 pieces that we have to work on this. One is the social equity, I call it social democracy issue, and it's not about socialism versus capitalism. I'm a capitalist, but it's really about making sure that we don't have to have these big widening gaps of inequality, because when you do, the numbers work out like that. The second thing we have to begin to do is understand the ways in which we can begin to retrofit the cities. And some of the things we can do, we're finding out, is it's not going to be a lot of expensive infrastructure. If you turn more lanes of street space over to buses, and the buses run frequently, people use them. One of my PhD students who's doing his dissertation on this now, has been looking at Toronto, where for reasons of history, they didn't, they never stopped suburban bus service. They kept improving it. So they have suburbs in Canada that look like, around Toronto, that look like U.S. suburbs with single freestanding family houses. And they have the same kinds of volumes of metro use because people can get to the metros without a lot of waiting time. The trick on transit is frequency of service and speed of service. And those are things you could do with some of the existing infrastructure. My bigger point here is that, what this raises and what's come up, because everybody was concerned about this, the elephant, the elephant, yeah, is in Washington, is in the red state. No, the elephant in the room is the fact that the things that people have been talking about are things we have to do, but we have to also change the context. We've been living through an era of what's called fiscal austerity. We gave up, we had been in a Keynesian era when we used fiscal policy. If you pick up today's Financial Times, which I did, you will see that what essentially all the bankers are saying is we need fiscal policy again, which means we need to spend money, and we need to spend money on social equity. And I think that your presentation makes that clear, and that's the second piece to this challenge of accelerating the SDGs. And it's an international question, too. It's not just a U.S. question. Thank you.